Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Michelle Hoover discussing her mother's book, Milk Without Honey, with Randy Susan Myers, and that's tomorrow. You can register for this and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Ida B. the Queen. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. We're very excited to welcome Michelle and Renee. I want to tell you a little bit about them and then I will turn the event over to them. Michelle Duster is a writer, speaker, professor, and champion of racial and gender equity. In the last dozen years, she has written, edited, or contributed to 16 books. She co-wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream, co-edited Shifts and Michelle Obama's Impact on African-American Women and Girls, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She has written articles for Time, Essence, Refinery 29, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, and other publications. Michelle has appeared on television programs on MSNBC, CNN, WTTW, CBS, and CW, as well as numerous radio shows. Her advocacy has led to street names, monuments, historical markers, and other public history projects that highlight women and African Americans. Michelle's many awards include the 2019 Multi-Generational Activist Award from the Illinois Human Rights Commission and the 2019 Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Award from Dartmouth College. She's a native Chicagoan. Renee Graham is an opinion columnist and associate editor for the Boston Globe. She started as a general assignment reporter and then moved to features and arts covering music, film, and television as a writer and critic. She also wrote a weekly pop culture column. Renee writes on a variety of subjects, including race and racism, domestic violence, LGBTQ issues, police misconduct, gun control, and politics. Renee is also a regular contributor on WBUR, the Radio Boston program. And without further ado, I will turn the event over to Michelle and Renee.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Stacey.
So I think we're going to start with Michelle reading a part of her book, Ida B. the Queen.
Well, before I read, I'll just kind of preface it by saying that the book has 7 different sections that are almost self-contained, so they can be read pretty much read in any order. But one of the things that I wanted to do in the book, one of my goals was to humanize my great-grandmother, in addition to talking about, we're helping people understand her life story and the work that she did, the times that she lived in. I also wanted to give as much information as I could, or much perspective on her personality and some of the challenges that she faced and how she handled them. So this excerpt, I was intentional about including into the book because for me, it exhibited her personality. Ida was aware of the difference in protection she could expect compared to white women, and she did everything possible to avoid dangerous situations or others that could tarnish her reputation. She was so vigilant about it that she demanded that a pastor write a letter to speak to her character in 1891 after hearing that he had been disparaging her name in his community. Ida had stayed over as the guest of the minister and his wife while in Vicksburg, Mississippi, on a sales trip for the free speech. Both Ida and the sister-in-law of the minister stayed at the house. The 2 women happened to converse with some men who visited the house during their stay. Later, Ida learned that the pastor had spoken to people about how virtuous Northern women were in comparison to Southern women, implying that the Southern-born Ida was herself not virtuous. The minister's wife had fished Ida's torn up mail out of the trash and read a letter in which Ida referenced losing her teaching position in Memphis. After his wife relayed the contents of Ida's private correspondence, the minister twisted whatever Ida had said in her letter to imply that her lack of virtue versus her outspokenness explained why the Memphis school system had not renewed Ida's contract to teach. Not only did he and his wife sully Ida's name, they also completely erased the fact that she'd taken the school system to task by exposing the vast inequality between Black and white schools. This assumption and his willingness to share it with others was insulting on multiple levels. Ida wrote the minister insisting that she meet with him in person the next time she visited Vicksburg. She arrived flanked by all 5 of the close friends who relayed the minister's slanderous remarks about her. It was very important that he set the record straight about her reputation. She was a single Black woman. She was a businesswoman, and she needed to make sure that her reputation was intact for both her safety and for her business. She insisted that he apologize, not only to her in person, but also publicly from his pulpit. She wrote the statement for him to say, which read, "To whom it may concern, I desire to say that any remarks I have made reflecting on the character of Miss Ida B. Wells are false. This I do out of deference to her as a lady and myself as a Christian gentleman." She told him that, quote, "her good name was all I had in the world, that I was bound to protect it from attack by those who felt that they could do so with impunity because I had no brother or father to protect it for me." She wanted him to know virtue was not at all a matter of the section on which one lived, that many a slave woman had fought and died rather than yield to the pressure and temptations to which she was subjected. I had heard many tales of such. Ida emphasized, I was one Southern girl, born and bred, who had tried to keep herself spotless and morally clean as my slave mother had taught me. Luckily for that pastor, she showed him some extra grace in writing. In her autobiography, she noted that she will not mention his name because he is still living and occupies an honorable position. So despite his rush to declare her unfit for polite society, the minister appears only as Reverend with a dash in her recounting of the incident.
I absolutely love that story because I feel like it says so much about who this woman was and how she carried herself in the world and how she respected herself and demanded that respect from others. And I just love that you picked that story because it just for people who aren't familiar with your great-grandmother, it really does say a lot about her, doesn't it?
I think so. And I mean, it's a small, incident that happened in her life. But for me, as a, direct descendant of hers and trying like through my life, journey to get to know my ancestor who I never met. She died 32 years before I was born. So I've only been able to get to know about her through, oral history, through obviously research. And then for me, searching through her writings to get a sense of her personality and the times that she lived in, the realities of being a woman. During her lifetime, which was 100 years, she's 101 years older than me. So I was born almost exactly a century apart, from her in the same country. And I've had my own, challenges and struggles as a woman, especially a woman of color, living in this country. And so for me to kind of read her challenges and her experience and how she handled making sure that she was safe. I mean, this is very important, that she did what she could to make sure she was safe, because she lived during very dangerous times. It was mob rule and total lawlessness for any Black people, but then for woman. On top of that, it was even doubly dangerous. And so she was so vigilant in making sure that her reputation was spotless, and no rumors could be, run amok. And so, and then the fact that she confronted him face to face. To me, that says a lot about her personality. She was 29 years old when this happened. And she lived in Memphis, and at the time she was living in Memphis, and by that point in 1891, she was co-owner of the newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech. And so she was a businesswoman, and she needed to maintain her reputation as a businesswoman in order to, grow her business. And one of the few, Black women in the country who don't have any kind of ownership of a newspaper. So she had so many reasons to make sure that her reputation was upheld. But so that was one of my goals with overall with the book. In that particular passage, I was very conscious and deliberate about incorporating it into the book, because for me, I felt like I could imagine, her flanked by 5 men. Like, we're going to make sure that, that she has her back. And then I loved how she wrote the apology for him. She did not leave any stone unturned.
Well, that's what's so great about it. There's this sort of balance between the idea that she understands the risk to her name, but she also knows that she needs to do the right thing for herself, that she's not going to allow this man to disparage her good name, because I think there's a point in the book where she talks about what it means to protect your good name. All you have is your good name. So I love that you use that story to open this evening. Let me ask you, Michelle, what did it mean to you and your family last year when your great-grandmother was awarded a special Pulitzer and the community mentioned her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching? What did that mean to you and your family?
It's an incredible honor for her to be recognized for the work that she did. And the fact that 90 years, well, last year was 89 years after she passed away, for her to be honored, to us, it just showed that her work is timeless to an extent, and it still is relevant so many decades after she passed away. And then, on top of that, during her lifetime, she did face a lot of danger. She lost her printing press, and she was exiled from the South. Her life was threatened because of the fact that she was uncovering uncomfortable truths and shedding light onto the realities of the lawlessness and what was going on regarding lynching after her friends were killed in Memphis. She had 3 friends who owned a grocery store, and they were lynched basically because they were successful. Long story short, there was a white-owned grocery store, and the owner decided to basically attack the 3 Black men's store. They defended themselves, and then they're the ones who were turned around to be the aggressors and were jailed and eventually lynched. And so my great-grandmother was outraged by this, and she encouraged people in Memphis to boycott the streetcars and to boycott white-owned businesses, and for those who could afford to actually leave Memphis. And she stirred up so much disruption that her life was threatened, and she ultimately was exiled from the South. And so, for 2021, for her to be recognized for the work that she did was sort of poetic justice, for her to finally, receive such a high honor, considering what she lost, as a result of the journalism that she was doing.
What's interesting in that story is the realization that Black achievement followed by white backlash didn't begin in 2016, for one, but also, again, the risk that she spoke up, that she stood up. If she didn't, nobody would have blamed her. These were very dangerous times and very dangerous things to do. But she lost her home. She lost her, she was born in the South. She was born in Mississippi, and she had to leave the region because the threat had become so great. And then she goes to Chicago and the work continues. And there's something so inspiring about that, that at great personal peril, she continued to do this work that meant so much to her, and to stand up for not just her friends, but for her community and really for her country. I mean, that's the funny thing about civil rights activism. It's for the country. It's not just for a group of people. It's to make the country live up to its own ideals. Now, you grew up knowing obviously about your great-grandmother and her place in history, but it wasn't really prominent in your life as you were kind of finding your own place in the world. And in the book, you talk about feeling slightly disconnected from all the hoopla. But I've heard you say in interviews that around the time that you turned 21, you had an epiphany about your great-grandmother and how it kind of influenced the trajectory of your life. Can you talk about that?
Right. Well, just to get back up as far as like how I grew up, because a lot of people, are curious about that. I am my grandmother on my father's side of the family is Ida B. Wells's youngest child, her youngest daughter, her youngest child. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. I grew up around her. We used to go swimming every week. I would spend the night at her house. I went to church with her. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. And I knew that Ida was her daughter. Ida was her mother. But my grandmother, because I spent so much time with her and my father, I'm related through my father, they, both of them, wanted us, and I say us because there were a total of 15 grandchildren, and one of 15 grandchildren, one of 3 children of my father's. My grandmother really wanted us to know who her mother was, but she also really strongly encouraged all of us to have our own sense of identity and our own sense of accomplishment. And she was very adamant about that. And I think I appreciate that now because I never felt any pressure to live up to somebody else's accomplishments or to follow in somebody else's footsteps or to be like somebody else. We were all encouraged to be our best selves. And so I knew who she was. I knew that she fought for freedom, justice, and equality. I knew that she was a journalist. I did not know when I was growing up the extent of the violence that she faced or that anybody faced in the country. I mean, I just didn't know the extent. And I think even today, most people don't know the extent of the violence that people were like burned alive and, fingers were cut off and used for souvenirs. I mean, that kind of detail of the violence I didn't know. So I when I was in my 20s was when I realized that I was around the same age that Ida was when she sued the railroad. She sued the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Railroad when she was only 22 years old because of, they asked her to go to she was in the ladies' car and they asked her to go the colored car, which doubled as a smoking car when she was commuting between Memphis and Woodstock, Tennessee. And she refused and basically was physically assaulted by
forcibly
3
removed from the
men of the railroad. And so ultimately she sued on the basis of the fact that the cars were separate and unequal when the law said that they were supposed to be separate and equal. So it was around that time when I was around the same age that my great-grandmother was, when I was like, whoa, she did all this when she was 22 years old. Like, what am I doing with my life? And that's when it hit me that she was so young. I mean, when you're 10, 22-year-old seems old. Right. But when you're 23, 22 doesn't seem old. So that was what kind of, made me realize that she was really young when she was, doing some of these, challenging these systems.
She won that case, that lawsuit against the railroad, didn't she?
She initially won in the Shelby County, Circuit County court, but then the railroad appealed it, and it went all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and it was ultimately overturned in 1887. So she actually ultimately lost. And not only did she never receive she was supposed to receive $500 in damages, which was a lot of money, because given the fact that her salary was around $60 a month. So that was almost a year's salary. But she never received it. And then on top of that, she ended up having to pay court costs of $200. So she really lost in the end. I mean, it was a big hit for her, not only financially, but also I really believe, and based on how she wrote about it in her diary, and ultimately how she faced different things in the future after that. I think what happened mentally for her was that she lost faith in the legal system, that Black people could get justice through the legal system. And for that reason, it seems like from that point forward, she was trying the cultural, norms in the court of public opinion versus going through the legal routes.
Right. Now, she was born 1862, so she was born into slavery. Her parents were enslaved people. But once the war was over, once emancipation came, they were politically progressive. They were politically active, weren't they? And what influence do you think that had on her? And talk a little bit about, and you do in the book, talk a little bit about the political nature of her family growing up.
Right. Well, so my great-grandmother was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is an urban area, especially at that time. And her father was a carpenter, and her mother was a cook in a house that now is the Ida B. Wells Barnett Museum. And so she grew up in an urban area, and given the fact that she was born in 1862, which was only 3 years before the Civil War ended, she really came of age during Reconstruction. That small window of time from 1865 to 1877, when there was a lot of progress for formerly enslaved people, including the 15th Amendment, which gave formerly enslaved Black men the right to vote. And so her father, based on what she wrote about him, I mean, he was very politically active. He was very enthusiastic about taking advantage of his newfound rights. He also was a business owner. He was a carpenter and had his own business. And he took advantage of the right to vote, which was significant as far as his life and how it affected Ida, because he voted the opposite way than his former enslaver instructed him to. And then as a result, he was still working for him at the time, and living on the property. So his former enslaver basically shut down his carpentry business. He locked him out of his tools. And so Ida witnessed firsthand the idea of standing up for your principles and possibly losing something, but then just rebuilding. And so that's what happened with her father. And I think that had a big effect on her, because that's pretty disruptive for a family to, lose their home or lose where they're living, and, for your parent to have to restart their business. But also, at that time, the illiteracy rate was very high among formerly enslaved people. And Ida was one of the first generations to have the opportunity to become formally educated at Rusk College, which was in Holly Springs. It's an HBCU that still exists today. And so she was asked by her father to read the newspaper to him and his friends. And I think that gave her preparation for later in life, for her to do speaking, and also not being afraid to, speak in front of men. So she grew up in this environment that was just, the impression that I got was that there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about, taking advantage of all of these new rights and progress, and growing up in an environment where people, talked politics and talked, social issues, and, were in politically and civically engaged.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned her, knowing how to read, reading the newspaper to her father. This became this love of words and understanding the power of words and how to use words to change minds. And that she starts writing, and journalism becomes her sort of great vocation. Can you talk a little about that? How, the role that journalism played in her life and how that really gave her this international reputation.
Right. Well, she started her career as a teacher at the age of 16 because unfortunately both of her parents died within a day of each other during the yellow fever epidemic in 1878. And so things were way different in 1878 than they are in 2021. And so she was able to get a job as a teacher at that young of an age because she simply needed to pass an exam, and she was educated. So she was able to pass the exam. There was a high need for teachers in this rural part of the South that was still rebuilding after the Civil War. And so she did that for a couple of years. She was taking care of her 5 younger siblings. And she was able to manage that for a couple of years. And then she went to move to Memphis with 2 of her sisters. And she started teaching initially in Woodstock, Tennessee, but then eventually in Memphis, which was a higher paying than it was in Woodstock. But she made it clear in her own writings that teaching was not was not her calling in life. It was something that she could do because she was educated. And so and she even mentions that the limiting number of professions that women could do at that time. And so out of all of the choices, for her, teaching was the best option. But she felt confined in that profession. And she made it clear that that it wasn't as much of a creative outlet as she really wanted for herself. And so she got involved in lyceums, which were sort of like literary clubs, that she participated in, and would do recitations and readings and poetry and plays. And people do these things still today in different sort of literary clubs. And so that was her creative outlet outside of her teaching role. And she got involved in writing for the newsletters initially for the lyceums, and people started to realize that she had a talent writing. And that's how she started, kind of as an outlet from her job. And then her reputation grew, and she started getting more and more opportunities, to the point where she eventually became a co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech. And by that time, she had a national following with her writing because her articles were reprinted in newspapers around the country.
And she was still very young when this is happening.
She spent her Memphis years, her years in Memphis were pretty much her 20s. She lived in Memphis for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And then she ultimately was run out in 1892 when she was exactly 30.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump ahead a little bit, because there's something in the book I don't think a lot of people are aware of, is that she was one of the founders of the NAACP. In 1909, and somehow that just gets left out of history a little too often. But you also write that she grew really frustrated because a lot of the leaders of the organization were white moderates who wanted to study the race problem instead of taking the decisive actions that she knew would be necessary to affect change. And immediately it made me think of what Martin Luther King would say decades later about white moderates being the greatest impediment to racial progress. But also, they took her platform for anti-lynching and didn't give her credit. They chose W.E.B. Du Bois to edit the magazine Crisis, even though she had extensive credentials as a journalist. And what I'm struck with is the sexism, even within the civil rights movement, that she was constantly confronted with. Talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go to the flip side of when she had to deal with racism in other social justice movements.
Right. Well, I mean, specifically with the NAACP, I mean, you pretty much summarized it. She was selected. There was a call that was sent out after in response to a race riot that took place in Springfield, Illinois, in 1908, which really mobilized the sort of activists in the country, because Springfield, Illinois, is the capital of Illinois, and it was also the home of President Lincoln. And so, you know, considering that he was given credit for ending slavery, it was just considered unconscionable that a race riot would take place in that particular location. Not that it's okay anywhere, but there was something specific about Springfield, Illinois, that just kind of, you know, shook people. And so there was this like, what are we going to do about, you know, race relations in this country? And so there was a meeting that took place in New York City. My great grandmother went there as one of the representatives from Chicago. And so as a result of the meeting, that's what the NAACP formation came out of it. It wasn't, I mean, that it was formed at that point. But yeah, she really, all you just summarized it. I mean, she was frustrated fairly quickly with what she felt was too much focus on studying the problem versus sort of action. And I do believe, I mean, she was very subtle about it, but I do believe that she was felt slighted when it came to Du Bois being chosen as the editor of the Crisis magazine, because she had a national reputation. I mean, and she had worked alone for so many years to highlight, you know, the atrocities when it came to lynching. She was also from the South, you know, she was from Mississippi, and Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He was born free, you know, so for many reasons, you know, she felt that she had the insight and the tools and the reputation to take this on. So yeah, she got disillusioned with the NAACP fairly quickly, and she actually got involved in the NERL with William Monroe Trotter, the National Equal Rights League, and the two of them were considered the radical and militant ones, versus the people, the NAACP was considered more moderate.
Which is so interesting because history hasn't been kind to Trotter as well. His name is big here because I'm in Boston, but generally people do not know William Monroe Trotter, probably for the same reasons. The idea of the radicalism and how that was offensive, perhaps, to the people who actually write the history books. Your great-grandmother, in doing her work, she traveled internationally and spoke a lot about what was going on here. Talk a little about what those experiences were like. You write about them in the book, but people were not really happy with what she was saying when she was outside the United States, and it attracted some unwanted attention, let's say, in the US. Talk a little bit about her experiences overseas.
Right, well, she was invited to go. First of all, she lived in New York City for about a year. Well, specifically Brooklyn, because you know there's a difference between Brooklyn and New York, right? So she lived in Brooklyn because at that time they were two different cities. Brooklyn and Manhattan were two different cities. So anyway, she lived in Brooklyn for about a year, and she was embraced by the Black women's clubs in New York, and they're the ones who really were very instrumental in helping her get her message out through speaking engagements. And so they booked different speaking engagements for her in the area. And when she was giving one of these speeches, basically, you know, continuing on with what she was doing in writing about what was the realities of lynching. She wrote Southern Horrors, Lynch Law, and all its phases while she was in New York, which was a compilation of articles that she had written for the New York Age with T. Thomas Fortune. So while she was in one of these speaking engagements, a woman from England was in the audience and heard her. This woman, her name was Catherine Empey, and she she was part of this other organization in Britain called the Society for the Brotherhood of Man, which was focused on sort of equal rights for everybody. Mostly at that time, they were focused on India, the country India. And she wrote an article in her newsletter about what she heard Ida say. A woman named Isabel Mayo lived in Scotland and read this article that was written by Catherine Empey. And I mean, it's just amazing how your life can change in a minute, right? So these women read about her, and so they were like, we have to have her come here and talk about this, because they couldn't believe, Isabel could not believe what she was reading. And so they first contacted Frederick Douglass, and he's the one that was like, no, Ida needs to be the one to go. So she traveled at the invitation of Isabel Mayo, who was sort of like the sponsor of this, to travel around in the United Kingdom. So she did that in 1893 for, it's hard to say, I think it was around a month. And she came back to the US to come to Chicago at Frederick Douglass's invitation to write a pamphlet to protest the exclusion of African Americans from the World's Fair. Mm-hmm. And because she had spent time overseas, she knew that people in other countries were being told really false information about the realities of lynching. So she was really like geeked up to help the world know what the realities were. And so she was focused on, at the World's Fair, getting the world to know. And then she ultimately went back to England, specifically England, not the United Kingdom. There is a difference. And in 1894. And she wrote a column called Ida Abroad for the Daily Inter-Ocean. This was another example to me of how Ida was an advocate for herself, because she was invited to go on the speaking tour with her travel and expenses paid. Mm-hmm. But then it was like, well, how was she going to live? You know, I mean, it's like, okay, well, you can pay my travel, you can pay my expenses, and then I have no money. So she went to the Daily Inter-Ocean editor and pitched the idea that she would write an article, a column, while she was overseas and get paid. Mm-hmm. And I love that story about her, that she figured out a way to get herself paid.
And freelancers are still doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She advocated for herself, and I'm so glad she did, because she left behind, you know, a series of columns that she wrote while she was in England, and those were very interesting. It was very clear in those articles that, well, she was meeting with like all the top leaders all over the country. She traveled all over England. She gave speeches, what she called monster meetings, to like 1,500 to 2,000 people at a time, you know, talking about what was going on regarding lynching. She wanted to have the British put international pressure against the United States regarding, you know, basically human rights violations, which is what we are doing today when we talk about like places like Myanmar or, you know, some other places, right? So that's what she was doing in 1894.
It's almost like she wanted other countries to have sanctions against the US.
She wanted the British to boycott American cotton. And which was, they were a huge importer of American cotton. And one of the things, the main thing that struck me while I was reading her column was how she subtly, but to me very clearly, expressed how she felt free for the first time in her life. She talked about sort of mundane things as far as riding the train and walking down the street and, you know, getting the newspaper and just different little things. But the way she talked about it was like, oh my God, like nobody's accosting me. I don't have to look over my shoulder and see if I'm in, you know, on the wrong side of the platform. And, you know, I could sit anywhere I want to on the train. She talked about these kind of minute kind of things that she was just doing, but in a way, her writing style for these articles was very different than the rest of her pamphlets. And it just made me feel like she was relaxed. which is really interesting that the only time she felt relaxed was when she was not in her own country.
Which is really heartbreaking at the same time, that she had to leave the country of her birth to feel relaxed and to feel like she can fully be herself without repercussions. You know,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's a pretty harsh indictment of this country. This month, I believe, marks 90 years since your great-grandmother passed away. And obviously the cornerstone of her work was her anti-lynching crusade. And there is still no federal anti-lynching law in this country. Why do you think that's the case? And are you optimistic with the new administration about its passage in what there's a bill, but are you optimistic about its passage into law?
I try my best to be optimistic. I really try. Uh, but there are some things, that sort of make me pause, to get my hopes up too high. Just some of the rhetoric that I hear coming out of some people's mouths, the attitudes that are displayed, just makes me feel like there's some of the attitudes haven't changed very much since my great-grandmother's time. So we just have to have a majority of people who feel differently than some of those people. And right now it seems like it will be a very slim majority.
Right. Although it seems absurd that in 2021 there's still a discussion being had about whether or not this country needs to have an anti-lynching law. I think it's something people assume already exists, and somehow it just hasn't gotten there. We're getting a little tight on time, but I do want to ask you, we're at the beginning of the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, and it's been a really difficult year for Black people, for communities of color, the economic fallout from COVID, the disease itself. Reading the book, I often found myself wondering how your great-grandmother found the stamina to go on. In addition to everything else, she married, she raised a family, and she continued to do her extraordinary work. With everything that's going on, where do you find hope in America? Who do you look through to pull you through?
I teach, and so that's what gives me hope is the students. I just feel like the younger generation gives me hope because they are very resilient. They're very social. I can only talk about the students I have. And they're funny, they're very socially conscious and politically involved. Like during the 2016 election, that several of my students were very, they were like, what do you call them, Bernie bros, whatever, Bernie, and they would go to the rallies and they would come to class and they would be all geeked up, and they like sometimes I'd have to be like, okay, let's just talk about what's going on before we get to what we're doing here, and so I was just really, I've always been very just it gives me hope, when I just see how enthusiastic they are. And then this past election, I challenged all of them to show me their I voted stickers, and we would share stories of what they did to vote and what they had to go through, because this past year, it was all COVID, so people were not necessarily all in the same location. So there were different states that the students were in, and it was interesting just to hear what different states, what they had to do in different states. So I try to not get too political in my class because I teach business writing, but I do give them space to talk, about some of the things they might be dealing with that, that could be causing anxiety or stress or worry or things like that. And so, I teach at a school where it's an artsy school. And so there are a lot of students there that might be affected by a lot of the policies that are sort of in question. And so, you know, being able to kind of see where their heads are and hear them, and it does give me, it makes me feel happy to know that they are aware and they're engaged.
Mhm. I was thinking that to do social justice work, you have to have hope. That has to be the carrot on the stick, right? That has to be the thing that keeps you going. So it's good to know that another generation is giving us hope. I think we're going to go to questions now from participants. So I will hand this back over to Stacy. And thank you very, very much, Michelle.
Oh, thank you, Renee.
All right, so we have one question for you, Renee, and one question for you, Michelle, from Amy, and they're different questions. So Renee, she would like to know about your personal connection to Ida B. Wells, when and how you discovered her. And Michelle, Amy would like you to talk a little bit about Ida's marriage to Frederick Barnett, who she says was a power couple in the best sense of the word.
I'll be quick. I studied journalism in college, and we studied, great journalists. We never studied Ida B. Wells. I didn't know Ida B. Wells existed until after college, and I started doing reading on my own. As a Black woman, as a Black journalist, she's hugely influential. The idea that she had a platform and she used it to make everything better. I think about that as a columnist all the time. It's rare to get the opportunity to do what columnists do. And so if you're going to have that platform and you're going to have that opportunity, you have to make the most of it, and you have to talk very directly to what's happening in America. So for me, Ida B. Wells Barnett is a huge hero. She is, she's like the oracle for so many of us who do this work, because I feel like she really made it possible.
My great-grandfather's name was Ferdinand Barnett, and he was an attorney who also owned a newspaper. He owned the Chicago Conservator, which was the first Black-owned newspaper in Chicago. So yeah, I mean, both of my great-grandparents were trailblazers. They were, I mean, by today's standards, they would be considered a power couple. But they were really, like their headstone at the gravesite says "Crusaders for Justice," and so they were compatible as far as their ideas about what this country should be, what it could be, and they both fought in their own way for justice and equality, because he, like I said, he was an attorney, and so he was deeply involved in fighting cases that to defend people who were wrongly accused of crimes. And there were several situations where my great-grandparents worked together as a team to fight on behalf of people who had, who needed representation. I gave two examples in the book of cases that they took on together to help people who got caught up in the system. My great-grandparents both founded the Negro Fellowship League, which was a housing rooming house for Southern migrants, men who came from the South during the first wave of the Great Migration. And the YMCA did not welcome Black men at the time. And so, I mean, I think my great-grandmother was the driving force to have the Negro Fellowship League founded, but I mean, my great-grandfather was right there with her. When she actually ran for state senate, believe it or not, in 1930, only 10 years after women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, technically, legally, because some people didn't have the opportunity to vote. So my great-grandfather, they put some of their own money into her campaign, and he was right there with her, passing out flyers and helping her with her speeches. And so they were a team, and I always knew that growing up. And maybe that was damaging to me, because I thought it was possible for men to be like that. like not intimidated by a woman who's ambitious and opinionated and strong-willed. And, I'm like, well, my great-grandfather was like that. So he's a great example. Men, take some notes from Ferdinand.
That's great. Michelle, another Michelle, thank you for writing the book and got her copy today and talked a lot about how beautiful it is physically and the illustrations and images in it. And I was wondering if there's anything that you wanted to say about putting the design into that and sort of how that all worked and the importance of it.
Well, I mean, so the goal of the book was to be different from other biographies that have been written about my great grandmother and other history books, because I mean I know based on, just like I said, I teach. Some people look at history in ways that they feel like they can't relate to it. It's like a long time ago. It's just a bunch of dates and names and whatever. What does that have to do with me? I mean, that's just how some people think, right? And so I wanted to create a book that is, makes the history alive and relevant to people's lives today. And that's one of the reasons why I incorporated so many people and organizations and initiatives and different incidents that have happened after my great grandmother's life, to show how there are people today that are doing the work, that they're continuing on the legacy that my great grandmother left behind, and they're working in her tradition. And so the point was to show how people are still doing the work, but also how our country still needs to have work done. And so to me, that shows that what is happening today is related to the past, and people can learn from the past in order to attack or to kind of deal with our realities today. Like you mentioned, the trial that's happening in Minneapolis. I just cannot say that man's name. I know it's his name, but I don't want to give him any airtime. But I mean, the trial that's happening today, of the Minneapolis cop. I saw just a little bit of the news today, just a little bit. And it's just disturbing, to watch this, the way that there's sort of, and I get it, it's their job, but they're trying to make it a character assassination against George Floyd, and sort of, justifying this murder that took place in broad daylight with cameras. And also creating a sort of narrative that people who witnessed a murder have the nerve to get angry. Like, how dare you be angry? And so it's almost like the witnesses are on trial. And so this is happening in 2021. And you think about what my great grandmother lived through, with people being burned alive, with crowds of 10,000 people, up to 10,000 people, where newspapers were complicit because they were advertising, come and see the lynching. Train companies were complicit because they gave special fares and special routes for people to come and witness the lynching. And so what is happening today, as far as how some of the questions are being framed and how some of the narrative that I am seeing, and I only watched about 10 minutes today, that to me is a direct line from what my great grandmother's time, what she was living through, in this sort of criminalization of Blackness. And this expectation that Black people don't have the right to be angry. That, to me, is exactly the same attitudes that were prevalent during my great-grandmother's time. So people can learn from my book how she managed to navigate through that in order to even get ideas about how to manage today.
Well, that leads to a follow-up question that Rachel asked, which is, what is the best way for us to carry on the legacy of your great-grandmother's work?
Well, yeah, I mean, in section 6 of my book, I divided it into different sections that were based on theme of what the type of work is that people can do and what type of work people are doing. One is countering the narrative, so using your voice through writing to tell the truth, to tell things from our perspective. That's you know, that's not sort of there was, okay, today we have what's called fake news. People want to call it fake news, right? During my great grandmother's time, and no offense, but this is what it really was called yellow journalism. So fake news is nothing new today. It just has a different name. And so she was countering the narrative of what was going on during the Fox News of her time. She was countering that. And so people can do that today. She was organizing. She was the founder of several organizations, and so there's collective action that can be done today in the same vein that she was doing. She, founded different organizations. She was part of the suffrage movement, which was, a lot of the movement was around obviously women organizing, and we have that today. With several organizations. I mean, now, the National Organization for Women, we have the League of Women Voters. I mean, there a lot of these organizations that exist today were founded around that time, that around 1920 or so. I mean, so there are various ways that people can get involved, and you can get ideas from reading the book.
There you go. Neil would ask if you could please talk about the Defender and Ida's work with that Black-owned newspaper.
Right. Well, the Chicago Defender was based in Chicago. It was founded by Robert Abbott, and my great grandmother did write some columns for the Defender, but she was never like an owner or anything like that. But her stepson, Ferdinand's son, he had 2 children from a first marriage. Ida was his second wife. His son Albert worked for the Defender for almost his entire career. So that's the most. I mean, my great grandmother wrote several columns for the Defender, but as far as a long-term kind of relationship with the Defender, that was really through her stepson, Albert Barnett.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one more. And Renee, this one is for you from Rhonda. And she asked if you could talk about what gives you hope today.
I think the fact that people are still fighting the good fight. I think the fact that we're still sitting here 90 years after Ida B. Wells has passed, and we're still fighting some of the same battles, but what's important is that we're still fighting. And progress is glacial. There's no question about that. And there's a lot of pushback. But I think it's so extraordinarily important that people haven't given up. And so when you saw people in the streets last summer, and people will be in the streets again, because that is how you start to push change. I think that's what gives me hope. I think it would be really easy to just sort of curl up on a ball and do nothing and let the horror wash over you. But I think the most important thing you can do, existence is resistance, right? And so I think it's very important that people still embrace these issues and understand why it's important and how we go about pushing this country to live up to its ideals once and for all. It's not going to happen any other way.
Great. Well, I think we're right at about 8 o'clock, so I think we're going to stop there. And thank you both so much, Michelle and Renee. This was a wonderful and important conversation. Michelle, your great grandmother obviously was an amazing woman, and it's great that you're getting her story out there. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight and listening to this conversation. You can buy the book at belmontbooks.com. There you go.
Get the book and support independent bookstores.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.